Yes, we sat next to each other last week in Washington. But there we spoke about Russia. Mein Minister, geht's Ihnen gut? Ja, geht's gut, ja.
We'll wait 60 more seconds to give the interested participants a chance to enter the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't be more excited to be here and hosting this very exciting and very timely panel with a panel that I couldn't have asked for more experienced, more knowledgeable and wonderful speakers to come up with a topic and a session titled A New Era in Transatlantic Relations. This panel comes on the eve of a very vital, very pertinent week of transatlantic relations. We just had the NATO summit in Brussels, and of course, the following meeting in Geneva between President Biden and President Putin, which of course very much factors into current transatlantic relations. Let me point out the wonderful speakers we have joined here on stage. To my very left, delighted to welcome the Polish Foreign Minister, Zbigniew Rau is with us. Lovely to have him with us. Next is his Romanian counterpart, Minister Bogdan Lucian Aurescu. Also, we have the Foreign Minister of Croatia, Gordan Grilic Ratman, with us. Very delighted to see on stage the former Foreign Minister and Vice Chancellor of Germany, Sigmar Gabriel, with us. And last but certainly not least, delighted to be joined here on this panel by the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs, Mark Kimmett. These titles, these names, should be motivation enough to listen to this new era of transatlantic relations that we are faced with. And Sigmar Gabriel, you've not only been the Foreign Minister of Germany, but you've also been the Vice Chancellor, and you're currently headed an organization titled the Atlantic Brücke, which is the foremost preeminent transatlantic organization in Germany. You are an expert and a close observer of transatlantic relations. Suffice to say, there's a conventional notion that the Trump presidency has weakened transatlantic relations, has damaged transatlantic relations. Do you think that this new incoming president, Joe Biden, does he have his mindsets? Does he have the motivation? Does he have the tools to repair transatlantic relations as we knew it?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation. I mean, not only in my country, maybe all over Europe, we are debating about the issue about the new transatlantic relation. And of course, the former President Donald Trump did a lot to split Europe. He did not pay any attention to the traditional alliances of the United States. For me, the US was always the only superpower who was able to form alliances. This was a kind of multiplier of force, and nor China, neither Russia had the capabilities to form alliances. They had dependents, but not allies. And so it was astonishing to see an American president in the White House who was ignoring this multiplier of force. And now America is back, as Joe Biden said, but of course not in the same kind like we saw it the last 70 years. I think the new president has a real mission. Not every politician and not every US president has a mission, but I think he has one. And this is to re-establish democracies and democratic values, first in his own country, and then, of course, in an alliance with other democracies around the world to fight against the authoritarian challenge we are faced with. And here you are back in the very beginning of what we called transatlantic alliance, or the West. The West is not, or was never, a geographical position. It was a normative idea about democracy, freedom of speech, individual rights, rights which are there because you are a human being, not because you're living in one country. And he wants to reestablish this and to form a new alliance of democracies, and there the traditional transatlantic alliance, of course, has its new a role, which is for us Europeans, and especially I think for the Germans, it will be a bit rough because it was so easy for us. Europe was founded not to be a global actor, because when we were a global actor, it was a disaster for the rest of the world. So we were trained to be off, and whenever something was to do, we had a bit the French, a bit the Brits, but especially the United States. And now the United States will be less European, much more Indo-Pacific orientated, because the majority of the international value is produced there. 5 nuclear power states are there, and the majority of citizens of the world are living there. So they are, of course, orientating to the Indo-Pacific, and the question to us will be, what's our responsibility in this tectonic shift of powers? And we as Germans, we have to discuss that we will not be able to project our international interests on American aircraft carriers because they are fading away to the Indo-Pacific. And that's a bit the new perspective for us, and it's will be interesting to see what's happening in Europe and in my country.
Indeed, a new era for transatlantic relations. Indeed, you pointed out Germany's always placed great importance on transatlantic relations, of course, due to its history, a relationship that is evolving, if not changing. Minister Rao, I know that transatlantic relations are not solely confined and limited to Germany and the US, quite on the contrary. Europe and the US, Poland plays a huge part in this. How do you assess not just the past 4 years, but more importantly, moving forward? Do you see signs of a recovery in the relationship that, by all accounts, may have taken a damage or two?
Well, first of all, let me begin in the most traditional way. Thank you very much for organizing this timely panel. Thank you for inviting me. The title of the panel, as far as I remember, is New Area in the Transatlantic Relations. And indeed, I mean, as far as I know, the US, it's a country where every new administration considers its term in office as a new era, which is absolutely justified. And I agree with Minister Gabriel, but certainly the administration, the Biden administration, has its own mission. And the outline of the mission was already indicated in the campaign, and now the administration is implementing it in the international relations. For me, the fascinating how to describe the ideas of this mission and how you describe later on the political reality. What strikes me there is, for example, the way in China is named. The issue is, in this new American mission, is China a rival or is China a competitor? And this brings us to some tensions, I would say, in the transatlantic relations, because we in Europe, certainly, we are more inclined to look at China, almost every country from a different reason. France, Germany, Poland, for example, is looking at China more and seeing it more in terms of competitor rather than rival. And as far as I understand, the mission you are talking about, it's more rival. And so there is obviously a few differences here. From the Polish perspective, quite frankly, we do realize that is to avoid unnecessary tensions in the world in which we regained independence about 30 years ago, and we did our standard of living. In the last 30 years, we have managed to multiply our GDP 5 times because of peace and stability around. So this is extremely important for us. Any tension in the Pacific area will translate into more tensions, I am afraid, in our part of Europe, simply because, well, we witnessed this Biden-Putin summit. There was no breakthrough there. So I expect that President Putin will conduct a very similar policy. So looking for an opportunity to destabilize the eastern part of the continent. So what is extremely important here, I believe that something is very important, what Zbigniew Brzezinski said, national security advisor to President Jimmy Carter, political scientist of Polish origin. He said, try not to corner China, because if you corner China and you encircle it, you can expect more tensions in the relations. So our interest is, and this is a very European interest, EU interest, to mitigate all these would-be conflicts. But last sentence, if you allow me. We in Poland, given all the values Minister Gabriel was talking about, we do not believe that our distance from China is the same as the distance from the United States. We are firm believers in the transatlantic unity, but we want to use this unity in order to secure peace and stability. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Rao. I think it's very telling that even during the first two answers about a new era in transatlantic relations, China has come up twice as a potential stumbling block for relations, improving relations between the US and Europe. I think these are the signs of the times, Minister Aurescu, that we are facing. Clearly, transatlantic relations do not play the same relevance and do not hold the same significance to Washington as it once was. There's now a different, there's a different competitor out there, and the top national security priority for the United States is no longer Europe, is it?
Well, I would also like to first classically thank you for inviting me at this beautiful, forum. I would say that I do not agree with what you just said. And this is because I think, as Zbigniew just mentioned, the transatlantic partnership is first about unity, and I would add it's also about primacy. Primacy because unity, because of course neither United States or Europe can act alone in order to cope with the challenges that we are facing, and indeed there is a very challenging, dynamic and unpredictable international climate, especially as far as the security dimension of it is concerned. But second, within the transatlantic partnership, the two parts of this partnership, which is on one hand United States, on the other side Europe, they cannot act alone, and for them the partnership is the first of all strategic partnerships. So I would say that if we are to cope with the challenges of the international environment, I would say that, the transatlantic partnership comes first, and then together with the United States, we, Europe, are able to, deal with all these challenges. And this week, the week that just passed, with all these important events, especially if you take into account the succession of these events, show that I'm right. First, we had the NATO summit, and the NATO summit was very successful. During the NATO summit, President Biden reaffirmed the strong commitment of the United States for the transatlantic partnership within NATO. And within NATO, the transatlantic link is the backbone of the alliance and of Article 5. And President Biden was very clear about the commitment of the United States to Article 5 and collective defense. President Biden also mentioned the B9 summit, the Bucharest 9 summit, which he attended on the 10th of May upon the invitation of my president and President Duda of Poland, who are the co-initiators of this format. And President Biden attended that summit, and he mentioned that during the NATO summit, saying that he attended that because he wanted to give a strong message in favor of the security, the commitment of the United States for the security of the allies in Europe and for the allies on the eastern flank. Then we had the EU-US summit, was the joint transatlantic agenda for the post-pandemic period. So a lot of priorities which are listed there, a lot of issues that we want to tackle through dialogue and coordination and cooperation. And we have already seen that we are able to act together when we have sanctioned Russia and we have sanctioned China for various things. At the same time, in the same day, we have taken together, US and Europe, the European Union, measures against these challenges. Then, of course, we had the Biden-Putin summit. And I think the messages which were conveyed there on that occasion showed that indeed the coordination within the transatlantic partnership comes first. And we are able together to cope with these challenges, be it about China, be it about Russia, be it about, I don't know, the economic challenges of the post-pandemic, or be it about, I don't know, climate change or any other thing. So within this context, I think together, well, this partnership comes first, first above everything else, and then together we can, cope with these challenges.
The current state of transatlantic relations is and remains strong, says Minister Aurescu, and he sees no significant changes, if I understand you correctly, as far as the lack of priority on the part of Washington is concerned, still sees the transatlantic relations as quite resilient, Minister Radman. And indeed, we had the NATO summit where the importance and relevance of NATO was reasserted, but we also had the G7 summit where certainly you did see some cracks as far as a common approach vis-à-vis China is concerned. Now, needless to say, transatlantic relations remain vital to Europe. I think the question is more whether transatlantic relations remain first and foremost vital to the United States as well. What's your take?
Yeah, first of all, I would like also to express my happiness to be to be here in Antalya. It's so really great to be in good company. First of all, to ministers of European Union, and so very pleased to be with the former federal minister. It's my great pleasure that I was the Croatian ambassador, and Minister Gabriel was the minister whom I hand over my copy of credentials. Yeah, actually the topic, it's really a timely and relevant topic, so we are discussing right now. The title is very, very good, and what happened actually in 1 week ago, and first of all, the summit after 1.5 years. The last one was in London in the very beginning of December 2019. And of course, this meeting with our two leaders, USA and of Russia, I think for the world order, for the peace, for the stability of the world order is very, very important. Croatia is neither US nor Germany, but however, the nature of the NATO alliance actually lies on the collectivism, on the collective mechanism, solidarity, unity. For us as a small country and in a very sensitive geopolitical space, very, very important to be a member of this very important, of course, organization. And it was the really timely summit because strong NATO in a world of challenges, and there are so many challenges we face with, and it is somehow also the proof how is the alliance, how is NATO vital, flexible, adaptable to the new circumstances, adjustable. So, and the agenda 2030, it's something that so oblige us to do even more together to show our solidarity. Of course, in our lives they are good and better, however. But the question, was it weakened during the Trump administration, or is it now better? I think so. The U.S. as a co-founder of the NATO always stand by their next to their alliance, and I think so. With this summit, we are just showed our solidarity, unity, and NATO is very, very important, and not only because of the more political defense organization, but also for security. And they are for Croatia. So there is very important because of enlargement, Western Balkans. There is very important also the second, how to avoid duplication between the European Union and NATO, because we are almost the older European countries are also members of the NATO, and then so US and a role in Pacific. So I think the NATO is even the role of NATO is more important right now than ever.
We've heard from 4 European ministers gotten the perspective of Europe, the current perspective on transatlantic relations. For the view in Washington, let me turn to Mark Kimmett, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. Mark Kimmett, when you served, I would assume that transatlantic relations was very much a priority in Washington, was very much a priority. When you talk to your colleagues today in Washington, does that still hold true?
Well, first of all, Ali, thanks very much for having us. I think we need to realize that this is not a new era. The transatlantic relationship for the Americans, which pretty much started after the Second World War, has constantly evolved. I first spent 10 years in Germany, starting when I was 6 years old in 1960. Relationship evolve over time. If you think at the end of the Second World War, the relation was security, somewhat diplomacy, values, and economic. It has evolved. It is now much the reverse of that. It is now economic, diplomacy, values, security. So just as NATO has evolved from a geographical organization, I remember in 1992, the great debate in NATO was out of sector or out of operations. And I would say that given the challenges that we have today, there is a role, in the old days, on ground states. Look at the threats today. They are hybrid, non-conventional, online, and against state and non-state actors. And really, the size of the country or the capacity of the country doesn't matter, because candidly, Serbia has a significantly advanced online capability, more so than some countries, not only in Europe, but certainly around the world. Greatest threat right now to our economies, our greatest threat to our security is not the size of the Chinese army, it's the capacity of the Chinese military to interrupt our critical infrastructure, disinformation, deep fakes. So the real challenges are not the old days where, if I may be so rude, our view was the transatlantic relationship and NATO was formed to keep America in, to keep Russia out, and to keep the Germans down. Today, the challenge is to keep America in, to keep China out, and to keep Russia down. And it doesn't matter the size of the country. It doesn't matter where you sit at the table in NATO of 30. Each of the nations must contribute, and I think those in Washington, D.C. that recognize the relevance of the Euro-Atlantic relationship to challenge those challenges, recognize how important all the countries that are sitting up here are right now, to include Turkey.
Europe plays and continues to play an important role for the United States. That's Mark Kimmett, but only Sigmar Gabriel, as you pointed out in your initial remarks, if Europe is doing its homework as well. Europe has been quite preoccupied with itself, with a string of crises it had to deal with, from the euro crisis to the financial crisis, now, of course, the pandemic. Do you think Europe, formerly 28, now 27 nations, often not on the same page on many issues, is doing enough to be taken serious enough as a reliable partner from the view in Washington?
No, of course not. And maybe I'm a bit rude when I'm saying they do not see us as a reliable partner. They will not say it in the public in such audiences, but if you're there, of course they know that we are not united in Europe, that we in the competition about technology and innovation between China and the United States do not play any role. We are not really a player in this game. That we are, especially the Germans, not only, but the Germans especially, very much reluctant against military power projection, for example. So, and so on and so forth. But the most difficult issue is that we are not united. And of course that Britain left the European Union, it's seen very critical by the current US administration, because in some way Britain was always a translator of what's happening in the European Union, sometimes not so easy to explain what in Europe goes. As said, also a footprint of the Americans in this famous sentence, "Bring America in, Russians out, and Germans down." So it depends very much on our ability and capacity to be much more united, to be much more technological resilience, by the way, not only to China. As a German, I would say also to 5 American tech companies. I mean, we have some friends here which are very much or very close to the German automotive industry, for example. We are the masters of the universe in Germany since 200 years when it comes to the product. But since 10 years, the value chain is shifting to the data platforms. And there we are, without any own power. So we have to do, you say, our homework, to invest in technology, to invest in our own capabilities, to invest in our security, and of course in a more coherent foreign policy. I found it a good idea that the French President Macron said, we should form something like a European Security Council, and we should invite the Brits to be member. I mean, that's for a French president to invite the Brits in the European Security Council. That's interesting. So yes, if we will get more united, if our weight in technology and many other fields will go up, then our American friends will say that's number one in our alliances. If not, of course, there's the Quad and others. They are not so organized like NATO, but I would say politically, maybe they are more interesting today than we are. And we were not the first one who met Joe Biden. Yes, the first trip outside of the US went to Europe, but 2 prime ministers were invited to the White House before Biden came to Europe. There was the Prime Minister of South Korea and the Prime Minister of Japan. Nobody else around the world was invited in the White House because of the pandemic. These 2 gentlemen were there. That shows us that the United States, as by the way always, is not only a European power, it's of course also a Pacific power, and we have to do some more homework to hold them as close as possible, because we alone, we will not be able to have a sovereign Europe. We need the Transatlantic Alliance to balance the powers in our east neighborhood and as well in other parts of the world.
Tough words from Sigmar Gabriel, Minister Rau, you heard it. We Europeans are not doing enough. We're not unified enough. We're oftentimes not on the same page enough to tackle the many multi-corporational challenges that we're facing. Belarus, Ukraine, all conflicts and problems at the foot, in front of our own house, if you will, in our own backyard in Europe. And yet, with a very reassertive Russia, with a very confident China, it's high time for the Europeans to get their act together, no? Not to be disappearing in the midst of this battle of elephants, as some analysts are putting it.
So you are addressing this question to me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I must say that I do agree with Minister Gabriel when he is saying that the European Union has its own homework to do. But what do I understand by this homework? We need more economic integration of the European Union. What we really have to develop is a single market in which these four freedoms are going to be pursued in a transparent and fair and equal way. I suppose this is the best vehicle to the integration. As far as other things are concerned, we are talking a lot about sovereign autonomy these days in the European Union, and I believe that some elements of these rather confusing terms are worth pursuing, especially the economic and social resilience of the European Union. That's for sure. We badly need this. As far as these defense issues are concerned, you see, I'm taking an empirical approach. If NATO has proved itself in so many different circumstances that my predecessor described. We began, well, we were behind the Iron Curtain at that time, but NATO began with a post-war Europe. So every generation of political leaders were facing new challenges, but nevertheless, that's the institution in political and in military terms. It's proved itself and it's secured the best time in the history of Europe, time of peace. And this is very important. Without NATO, European integration could not have been achieved. Under NATO umbrella, this integration was achieved. So I believe that NATO, nothing can replace NATO in terms of common values that are at the bottom of these institutions, in terms of political unity and military unity. As far as our European foreign policy is concerned, it's a lot to be done here, and the unity is here absolutely necessary. I don't want to talk in this respect about Ukraine and Belarus, although we Poles, modest as we are, we consider ourselves better. We have a better know-how on these issues than our friends from Western Europe. That's for sure. In the same way that our friends from France and Spain are better experts on southern neighborhood, and we respect that. But what bothers me in terms of EU foreign policy is that, look, we have 6 countries of Western Balkans, and this is a proof of EU foreign policy impotence, because these countries are, there is an overall consensus that they should be allowed in, but it's not working. If you take a look at the situation in the East, in the area of Eastern Partnership, from the perspective of our constant failure as far as Western Balkans are concerned, you will realize how much work we have to do in terms of our common foreign policy. And okay, we should begin with our backyard. When we are thinking about remodeling the world, let's begin with our backyard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think it's clear that any panel these days that is discussing a new era or a continuing era of transatlantic relations turns into an inner European debate very quickly. I think that is also very telling that first of all, we sort of had to get our own house in order to be that reliable partner, which Sigmar Gabriel, interestingly enough, says Washington no longer perceives as one. Now, NATO, Minister Aurescu, Minister Rau said NATO, despite the differences and the shortcomings of Europe perhaps, still remains vital, still remains a cornerstone of transatlantic relations, something we're all in agreement with on this panel, I would believe. What are some of the other cornerstones that make up the vitality of current transatlantic relations, in your opinion?
Well, I would say that I think it's a lot of truth in what was said, that well, you can't have a better foreign policy. You can't have the European Union as a more efficient global actor, so outside the European Union, without putting our house in order. I think we need to be more efficient and to have more or better instruments inside the European Union in order to be able to project ourselves as a global actor. And indeed, perhaps the Conference on the Future of Europe might give us some interesting ideas on how to make the Union more efficient inside, and to improve our mechanisms and to become, well, closer to the citizens, closer to the citizens' needs in terms of prosperity and security, and then we will be able to project in a more, well, meaningful manner outside. We can't be a global actor if we don't have more influence in our immediate neighborhood. That's why we have discussed upon the initiative of Romania recently during the Gimnich meeting in Lisbon about the frozen conflicts or protracted conflicts in our neighborhood, how the EU can be more influential in dealing with the settlement of these conflicts. You can't be a global actor if you can't solve things in your immediate neighborhood. Again, I think it's important also to see the transatlantic relationship in a manner which is not that simplistic. I mean, it's not just about United States on one hand and European Union on the other. You have also Canada, for instance. You have Europe, which is larger than the European Union. I think also the US-Turkey relationship is important as far as the transatlantic link, or UK-US relationship is important in these terms. And also the dynamics within these organizations that we are talking about. You mentioned, and we have discussed about NATO. And indeed, EU, for instance, can be, well, and I think we can improve the activity of the Union in certain areas, but perhaps in other areas there is no need to do that. That's why we are also not very happy with the term of strategic autonomy, which means a sort of a 360 degrees orientation towards everybody, instead of promoting the term of strategic resilience. I would say that we need transatlantic strategic resilience, meaning what? Meaning that we don't want to be under the influence of non-like-minded actors, which are against the values of this transatlantic community. The transatlantic community is a community of interests, values, and security. And then we have to see, well, NATO as a cornerstone. You can't replace NATO. I agree very much with Zbigniew. Then you have the relationship between US and European Union, as it was discussed during this week. And we can work together, and EU can be, for instance, influential in working together with the US on, let's say, ending the pandemic, sustainable global recovery, fostering green growth, and strengthening trade, investment, technological development. And then we have other formats like the Three Seas Initiative. We and Poland, Romania and Poland are supporting very much, and Croatia is one of the founders of this initiative. And this is another contribution to the transatlantic relationship, because the US is very much interested in this format, which might be an opportunity to, well, bring more economic presence of the United States in Europe, in this region. Not only military presence, but also economic presence. We need this in order to have a strong relationship. And then it comes, and this is my last line, the bilateral relationship of all our countries with the United States. We have some of us strategic partnerships which are solid with the United States, and we promote the transatlantic link constantly, well, irrespective of the administration in Washington.
Transatlantic relations are not just made up of Europe and the US. Quite on the contrary, they are manifold, they are diverse, and they extend to other countries, non-EU countries and North American countries as well. Very complex world that we live in these days, Minister Radman, obviously, and the transatlantic relations, the cornerstone of the 20th century in containing an emboldened and aspiring, ambitious Soviet Union. Now, of course, we need different common themes in many shapes and forms. What, in your opinion, is the biggest stumbling block right now as far as transatlantic relations are concerned?
Yes, you mentioned, of course, that it is the cornerstone, but of course NATO is an essential forum for transatlantic relations and, of course, security, first of all. Actually, in your question, we are swamped actually with the challenges in the European Union. What could be obstacles and what could be the solutions? First of all, yes, probably we should just act multilateral. And for multilateralism, we need to have a unity. Probably the foreign and the defense policy is not more a common policy. It depends on the decision on the capitals. When it comes to the European Union, you can see that 27 countries, 27 theoretically approaches. And we need actually the platform how to get together, how to act together. More, so 27 countries, 27 histories, 27 cultures. It's in diversity, however. But what is important, 2 years ago, one politician said, first of all, I think we have to be, we should to rely on each other. And the politician said that in the world there are two profile of countries. Small countries and the countries, they are also small, but they are not aware of the fact that they are small. That means that they are not number one. Of course they are number one. They are number two, number three, and so on. But however, we should be to have this equality approach. Of course, that Mr. President Biden invited the president of the South Korea, Japan, of course, the U.S. Pacific power is very, very important. That means that, but it is just a concern on the peace in the whole world. I would say that the world is a small village, and so we should just not to try to avoid any form of misunderstandings. I don't want in the 21st century to say that we have enemies. We don't have enemies. Probably is our international law something that we should to change, or probably universal organization like United Nations and so on. We have to find the possibility, platform, how to get and act together. There is so many challenges. Russia should be somehow partner. China should be partner, and we should to find the way towards them. Actually, we missed so many chances in the past after the breakaway of the bipolar system, but probably is now the chance to get it. And we have the problems in the Middle East. We have problems also in Western Balkans. We have problems in Ukraine, Crimea crisis, and so on, everywhere. And we should just to tackle and to use our power and to produce the European values when it comes from European values and NATO. They match. They is the same actually. NATO is not more the defensive organization. It's more political defense organization. And I say I would say that there is a necessity how to act together, and it is now the chance.
Well, I think it's abundantly clear from your answer there's certainly no lack of challenges that we're facing in the 21st century in Europe and the US and transatlantic relations together in particular. Being mindful of the time, we're in the final stretches of this panel, but Mark Kimmett, very much as the 20th century was defined by the Cold War, this seems to have the makings of a US-China century in many ways. And Europe's role and how it positions itself is going to be clear. It seems to me that the Europeans, and Sigmar Gabriel, the Germans in particular, seem to China principally through an economic and not so much a national security lens. Mark Kimmett, do you see the biggest challenge, the biggest obstacle, the biggest ingredient for deteriorating transatlantic relations over China?
No, I see the biggest challenge to the transatlantic relationship is what's happening in America right now. We heard 4 senior Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials grapple with the question of how Europe can come together, and it never has. But I would tell you right now, inside of America, we have our own grappling. We have the issues of COVID. We have people that don't want to take the COVID vaccine because they believe it has trackers or has some sort of problems. We have a significant economic problem, which is hidden by the fact that we're using a credit card to finance our nation. We have doubled the United States debt in the space of 6 years. We have significant questions within America about our history, whether we have endemic racism, whether we have so many issues looking internal to the United States. If there is a feeling among Europe and other countries that we are neglecting them, I think it's because we're focused inside with our own challenges. So the next 10 years may not be about the transatlantic relationship. It may be with the relationship of ourselves, and as a result, we may be neglecting our friends. Now, it's important, I think, to understand, you talk about, well, Europe is not important, that China's the threat, Russia is a challenge, but what other organization shares the same values as Europe? We have interests around the world. We have interests with South Korea, we have interests with Japan, we have interests with other countries. But those are not countries that necessarily share our values. The countries that share our values, and values are so incredibly important, are the ones that are sitting up on this stage. So don't think that America is neglecting you because we don't care. America right now, yes, we're concerned about China, but candidly, we have got a 5,000-mile ocean that protects us from China on the water. Again, as I said earlier, our greatest external threats are not on the ground, not on the sea, they are on land. So while Europe is beating its own breasts about its own internal challenges, please understand that America right now, in my 67 years, has never seen the types of internal challenges we have to the basic question of what America is all about than we have today.
The battle for the soul of America very much raging on, and certainly has not been silenced or defeated with the electoral success of Joe Biden. Clearly very much curious how the United States, as one of the remaining global superpowers, will deal with the internal strifes that your country has been dealing with for some time now. Something I'm sure many of the European representatives here, with the rise of populism and rise in ideology, can very much relate to. Gentlemen, before we wrap up, let's do a rapid fire round before we wrap up. Here once more from all of you with the plea for a 60 seconds answer. Sigmar Gabriel, the transatlantic relations that we talked about, I know, are very dear to your heart, not just because of your role as the chairman of the Atlantic Brücke, but also something that you have embodied through your time as the foreign minister. When you wake up in the morning, what makes you optimistic? We've already established that this is a very, very turbulent world, that this is a very complex world, very challenging world. You all have to deal with it when you wake up in the morning. The weight of the responsibilities that is on your shoulders, Sigmar Gabriel. What still, as an experienced politician, an observer of world affairs, what gives you hope?
I would say the history gives me hope, especially the history of Europe. I mean, remember what's happened after World War II, when my country, the fathers and grandfathers of my generation, killed millions of people all over Europe. They killed Jews in concentration camps in Auschwitz and in other parts. It was possible that our European neighbors, only some years after Second World War, they invited us, the Germans, their enemies there, those guys who went through their countries and killed their children, to build the European Union. And we needed less than one generation to come from Auschwitz to Brussels. I mean, that's really a symbol for what's possible if human beings really want to change the world. What's possible if people are brave, you have brave leaders. I don't think that the Italians, the Belgians, the Netherlands, the citizens there were very happy about the idea of their leaders to invite the Germans. But they did, because they knew if we would not go in this direction, the Third World War would just behind the next corner. I think this is a very optimistic history. What's possible if people really want to change history?
We've certainly seen worse times than the current ones, and the way Europe has dealt with its history has risen up, come together, unified in face of a terrible tragedy in history is indeed signs of hope, says Sigmar Gabriel. Minister Rau, you're all at the forefront. You're all politicians that people look towards for signs of hope. What gives you hope amidst this very confusing and sometimes troubling world that is out there?
Okay, what gives me hope every day, every morning when I wake up, right? To be quite frank with you, all the values, the basic values we are sharing, all of us here. I mean, human rights, the position of civil society, and the democratic rule. Why? Because I believe I'm a member of the Solidarity generation, and I know the value of these ideas and institutions, and I feel extremely happy when I look to our eastern border and I see young Belarusian people, especially people who are in the age of my children, and they are fighting exactly for the same values we used to fight. And I see the attachment to the same values, for example, in Ukraine. And there is no doubt in my mind that despite the fact that political calendar, so to speak, in our part of Europe is different than in the West, I'm absolutely sure that these people will prevail. I don't know when, but I do know that they will. I cannot imagine when these young Belarusians who are now in their 20s, they will recognize, they will submit their will to the authoritarian regime, that they will bring up their children in this submission, or their children. So that's absolutely impossible. And this is the greatest hope for me as a human being and a politician. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these uplifting words. Again, deriving your optimism very much like Sigmar Gabriel from the terrible past that the continent had, the terrible times that we've lived through. And of course, Poland very much endured the hardships of being behind the Iron Curtain throughout the 20th century. So here we are in the 21st century. Minister Aurescu, your country, of course, has not been exempted from that, but still shining through, rising again And therefore, what is your motivation? What is your hope of optimism moving forward?
It's no surprise that I share many of the views that Zbigniew just mentioned. We have been under a very heavy communist dictatorship, and we had a bloody revolution in 1989. And then in our road to democracy, this transition was tough. And we had ups and downs. And at the end of the day, what gives me hope is that when I see that we have a society which is already mature, and it's holding to the values of democracy and rule of law. And I think this is very important. And also, when I see that it's a society which embraces the EU values, and which is has one of the highest percentage of support for NATO and for the European Union and for the partnership with the United States, which, well, there is no surprise, are the 3 pillars of our foreign policy. So whenever I speak to my students at the law school in Bucharest, I see this, belief in these values, and I'm comforted by this. And this is the power of democracy, which was challenged last year during the pandemic. And still, I think we have a lot of good chances to prevail. So it's a hope for the future.
The resilient European societies and the new generations that, of course, have grown up under very different circumstances than you have is certainly sense for hope. Minister Radman, something I'm sure that you can relate to as well.
I like your question, and you mentioned terrible past and Signor Gabriel, so we can also I can also say the same. 30 years ago, no one could imagine that something could happen in the vicinity of at that time, the European community or European Union. So our freedom, sovereignty in Croatia was forged in homeland war, and it was terrible. A lot of victims and problems what happened actually in former Yugoslavia. However, the past is behind us. I am waking up and in awareness that so I live in peace, that we are very happy that we adopted European values, rule of law, that Croatia is a democratic state, totalitarianism is behind us, and a lesson is learned. And actually, we should not to find ourselves in the situation where we do not like that one is filling the vacuum instead of us when it comes to NATO and to European Union, and just to strengthen the European values, democracy, freedom, human rights, and then we can just live together. It is a message for the next generation, learned. So we were actually born so as individual to live alone, but to live together is something to be learned. And so with this kind of optimism, I see the future.
That's very lovely to hear. And Mark Kimmett, you get the last word. We've just heard from 4 foremost leading European politicians who all derive their trust in the EU, trust in transatlantic relations, and their belief in both from the resilience, from the history, from the hardship that these countries had to endure, and not so long. When I look at Minister Radman, you, of course, the United States is now going through a period, as you say, of internal strife, for the battle for the soul of America, and resilience is very much needed there as well. You sounded very cautious and contemplative when talking about the current state of the United States. How optimistic are you that the U.S., the pillar, very important pillar of transatlantic relations, will come through on the right side?
Well, I've got one word for you, and that's NATO. Despite all of the problems that we've had, the last 4 years were the only time that NATO came in question. And the subset of that, which is so important, is Article 5. The only time Article 5 has been invoked in NATO was on September 11th, when 4,000 of my Americans died. And for that, You were with us at the worst time, and we'll be with you at your worst time as well. That's what gives me hope.
Ladies and gentlemen, this wraps up a session which I think I speak for all has been extremely informative and very personal as well, which I thank you all for. This has not been one of those typical political panels, politicians panels with their scribbled notes, but really to go to the heart and bottom of what Europe is, what the US is, and more importantly, what transatlantic relations are and supposed to be in the 21st century. Thank you for your attention, and first and foremost, of course, and with that we wrap up, a heartfelt thanks to this wonderful panel. Thank you so much, gentlemen.